dictatorship of the proletariat, what is it? It's an interstitial form of rule dividing between where the economic structure of capitalism still exists, but the political but there is a change in the political composition of society where the bourgeoisie has no longer has power, but instead the working class has power, and increasingly, and this enables um, the working class to have legal sanction to begin um, expropriating the expropriators, right? Like collectivizing. I don't want to say nationalizing, but because that can be problematic. But definitely collectivizing all of the productive apparatuses that are necessary for the social reproduction of the whole of society.
All right, welcome back, friends and comrades. Daniel here with Ian Szabo, writer at Cosmonaut Magazine, socialist and Marxist thinker, and recent admittee to the history department at the University of Texas at Austin. Congrats on that, Ian.
Thank you.
So I've been reading Ian's work for quite a while, and I would say Ian's sort of at the forefront of what many have referred to as a neo-Kautskyist revival on the left. And I want to begin with a sort of basic discussion regarding that revival. It's a curious fact that Karl Kautsky, known as the Pope of Marxism during the Second International Period, um, hugely influential to Lenin and to the Bolsheviks, a figure within the SPD in Germany that had really been given the mantle of interpretive authority from Marx and Engels, and who famously um, voted for war credits prior to World War One, and subsequently was brandished. I mean, sort of his image was sort of destroyed by the socialist movement, by Marxists in some way. And I want to actually begin, Ian, with a your appraisal of what happened to the image of Kautsky and sort of subsequently, because there is sort of a historical record that we need to get clear about the significance of this figure, and why most people that read about Marxism today have such a sort of distorted view of him. Can you help us with that?
Yeah, I mean, well, even in your sort of opening remarks, I mean, you can see a lot of even the myths about Kautsky in your own sort of discussion because, like you mentioned that Karl Kautsky voted for war credits, for example. I mean, he did not have a vote in the Reichstag. He was the leader of a fraction within the Reichstag, which itself opposed, or a fraction within the German Social Democratic Party, which um, opposed the war. The problem was that what was it they what is it called when you don't vote? They abstained from the vote,
They
whereas
abstained. They
everyone
abstained.
else, yeah,
Right.
they abstained and
Right.
then ended up joining with Edward Bernstein in the USPD and the anti-war SPD. So already, I mean, like I mean, there's even just beginning to talk about Kautsky, we have to sort of like we have to like kind of clear everything out. And to be fair, I mean, like like this is how everyone is taught this stuff, um, and there is, I mean, I mean, the first off, I would say that in a certain sense, like Kautsky is kind of responsible. He's one of the players who sort of ruins his own reputation. Um, his later commitments to just completely opposing the Russian Revolution and Bolshevism, I think, and subsequently, I think it was his grandson, I think Ben Kautsky also sort of participated in this like sort of anti Bolshevik form of sort of centrist Marxism, that really found its way within the USPD. And we can talk about like really the disintegration of this sort of self disintegration of Kautsky after this sort of discussion. Um, but yeah, on the flip side, I mean, you get through Western, I guess what's typically referred to as Western Marxism, or the sort of legacy within Marxism that produced critical theory that begins with Karl Korsch and his book Marxism and Philosophy, which makes this really, in my opinion, dreadful argument about the Erfurt program, right? I'm sorry, Kautsky's, great text from 1891, the sort of long textual explainer to the. It's also referred to as the class struggle. The explanation part is the class struggle. The program part is obviously the Erfurt program. But he has this quote where he says that there isn't an ounce of genuine Marxism in this entire text, and this is, I mean, this is which poses the question of what is genuine Marxism then, and it ends up the case that for Korsch, it's whichever guy has the best reading of Marx and Hegel. Like that's, I mean, in Lukács, I'm making um, I'm sort of bending the stick with this argument, but I think more or less, I mean, the idea that theory needs to be in command ends up in the forefront of what we call Marxism, and it gets reflected in Lukács. It gets reflected in, and it gets reflected in critical theory in the Frankfurt School, and it completely hollows out the idea of the program while also completely forgetting that the Korsch's original statement, um, where he's quoting Engels at Kautsky saying, this is worthless, or with regards to the Erfurt program, the stuff that Korsch is referencing in relation to from Engels at Kautsky is referring specifically to the draft program of the Erfurt program, not the final product where they had taken much of Engels' advice and put it through. And to me, I would say like the idea of the program, even the most flawed program, is more Marxist than the best theory. If the point is that in form it pulls the whole organization together and makes them work collectively to generate a sort of perspective of what is necessary for working class to take power, because this is what differentiated Marxism from prior forms of socialism. Um, and I think it's what gets lost in post-war Marxism. This idea that the thing that we unify around has to be the program instead of, I'm sorry, the idea that we have to unify around theory instead of the program. Um, the flip side, I mean, is Stalin, in the short course on Marxism Leninism. He makes this, I mean, much easier to dismiss argument that there's simply no relation between the Second International and the Third International. Um, and I mean, this is sort of why you get these misreadings of Lenin, right? The idea that what is to be done founds the idea of democratic centralism, despite the fact that he never uses this word in the entire text. The idea that the idea of the vanguard party is there in what is to be done, right? Like this is also just neither of these things are in what is to be done. And if you read largely, what you see is, in fact, that this idea of the vanguard party is actually the idea of the merger formula of the merger between socialism and the workers' movement, with the and then you have the flip side with democratic centralism. It turns out that this is really the product of that this is really the an idea brought in by the Mensheviks in 1903 at the 1903 Menshevik conference in like November, I think. But I don't know. There's so many details that I end up losing track. But but what am I trying to say? So I was talking about um, the Stalin reading, and this sanctions both people on both sides of the Cold War to end up with essentially the same reading as Lenin, which kind of has this reading of which the byproduct of is also that they end up with the same reading of Kautsky. Um, Within the historiography, it's interesting. I'm reading Jeff Elley's Forging Democracy, which is sort of a great, I mean, I think actually is of a great example of sort of new left historiography around Kautsky, because he does talk about him here and there. And I don't want to besmirch that book. It's amazing. Jeff Elley's work is kind of unrivaled in many ways. But there is this sort of desperate searching for a sort of philosophical Kautsky that happens over the course of the 20th century as well, that views him as a very deterministic, very fatalistic thinker, that views him as dogmatic, um, uh, and dogmatic in his orthodoxy. I would argue that he is very orthodox, but I wouldn't view him as particularly dogmatic. But you have the sort of the same themes repeated over and over and over again. Is any of this? So this is a lot.
Yeah.
So is
No, it's
any of
good.
this
It's
further
it's really
questions?
good. So thanks for that overview. I think this is starting to gel for me and hopefully for listeners as well, in the sense that, I mean, to go back to sort of the question about how this all came to be, I suppose one way to think about this would just be to refresh your reading of some of the way that the polemics function um, between Lenin and Kautsky, which there are so many. We didn't even mention the renegade. The famous
Mhm.
the famous point being that most
Renegade.
socialists thought that Kautsky's
That
first
word is
name was
very important.
Renegade. Yeah,
Yeah.
the renegade Kautsky. And when you read Lenin writing about Kautsky, it kind of sounds, I would say, quasi theological in the sense of excommunication. I just did a big
Renegado
event.
is a word invented during the Spanish Inquisition specifically to refer. Yeah.
Right? And I mean, I just did a close study of the imperialism text, the highest stage
Mhm.
of capitalism, and Kautsky's all over that text. He's all over that
Mhm.
text, and the way that Lenin is referring to him is that he's outside of Marxism. But
Mhm.
but but that his being outside of Marxism is based on his interpretation of imperialism. So it is a theoretical point because, specifically it was Kautsky's theory of ultra imperialism that Lenin thought gave an implicit support for a non revolutionary left position, a social democracy position that would not be capable of seizing the opportunity that imperialism brings about for the workers' movement. And that therefore, Kautsky would inevitably fall in line with the bourgeois interests in the face of a war. And that kind of takes us back to my slight error at the beginning to say that he voted in favor of war credits. You can see why I said that, because if you read
Mhm.
Lenin, Lenin's giving us the impression that, well, in theory, Kautsky had already capitulated to that position. It was like a fait accompli.
Mhm.
So, do you agree with that? I was curious, like, how do
Well,
you parse
what year was the imperialism text?
16? 16.
16. Yeah. I mean, so Larsley's kind of argument is mainly, I mean, with regards to Lenin, is mainly, and I don't remember when ultra imperialism gets written. I think it's around the same time, if I recall. Um, and the thing is that Lenin had writings. I mean, I'm sorry, Kautsky had writings on Kautsky had writings on imperialism that were prior to this. Um, I haven't had the time to really dig deep into them recently, so I can't really speak that much to them. But my understanding is that there's a enormous shift in his thinking when he comes up with this. Like, I think for Lenin, a lot of the anger that you see in imperialism, the highest stage, is sort of saying like, wait, what? Like, you were talking about, like, your understanding of imperialism 10 years ago was much clearer, much closer to thinkers like oh god, but the economist Hilferding. It was much closer
Comforting.
to
Yeah.
um who's the British
Hobson.
um yes, much closer to Thompson, but most importantly, oh, what it's he's the British thinker who is also a men's rights activist, basically, who was the first person to really argue that colonialism gives a greater lease on life for capitalism. Um, uh, it starts with I can't remember his name. Um, um, I'll remember it at some point. And you see a lot of, I mean, and you actually see, I mean, so Kautsky and well, Kautsky, I mean, he's much closer to August Bebel. I mean, a lot of these people are very unambiguously opposing colonialism and imperialism, especially in something in like the 1907 Stuttgart Congress. Um, and there's an excellent essay by Jens Uwe Gettel called "The Myth of the Pro-Colonialist SPD," where he talks about how this idea that the split in the SPD begins in 1907, qua Chorska, is really a bit of a myth. That actually the anti-colonialist and therefore really kind of early forms of anti-imperialist politics um, cannot uh, cannot really really that form of politics, it finds itself much more it gets far more support from the rank and file in 1907 than the pro-colonial side of like Edward Bernstein and the revisionists. And I think it's also worth noting. It is worth noting, however, that there's a big difference between. I mean, I just said that there is a separation, and there isn't that much separation between Lenin and imperialism and the earlier stuff from social democracy. But that's not entirely true, because the primary modality that um, early critiques of imperialism and colonialism, more importantly, the way this really functioned among German social democratic thinkers was they placed the main problem was for them militarism, was that it created a sort of it created in the colonies a context where essentially military activity could be practiced and then could be brought back to the metropole and then subject the workers movement to that sort of violence. And this is mainly what they were opposing, right? And this is why, I mean, this is why the you know Bismarck's kind of this is why somebody like Bismarck's um, militarism was very heavily opposed, and later on the militarism of the Kaiser was also opposed. but there wasn't but it is worth noting that, like, there wasn't this much more highly developed concept of imperialism that you see in Hobson and also and obviously Lenin, um, or for that matter, Bukharin or Rosa Luxemburg. I mean, they're really the ones who are developing past this. I think Kautsky just wasn't. Yeah, I mean, it could be the case that you really find the early sort of disintegration of Marxism,
Yeah.
in Kautsky's thinking, um, because it's unambiguously the case that after 1916, you see the disintegration of like what the dictatorship of the proletariat can be. You also see the disintegration of the sort of strategy of intransigence, and obviously, the essentiality of the program. Although, and the flip side is who are the people preserving it? It's the Bolsheviks, right? Like Lenin
Yeah.
completely refuses to let go of the idea of the minimum program, for example.
So let's take a step back. All of that is very interesting, and I think shows the complexity, because when we get to the concept that we're really talking about today of dictatorship of proletariat, which I want to start by saying a few things about it from a historical point of view until we drive up to how Kautsky
Mhm,
theorized it. Um, because in Lenin's polemics with Kautsky, again, um, it is in part Kautsky's criticism of the way the Bolsheviks are instituting the dictatorship of the proletariat that draws further conflict between the two thinkers. So, what
mhm,
actually is this? What is this idea? Well, um, I did a program on this with Derek Varn, where we looked at two really seminal texts on the meaning of dictatorship of proletariat from kind of late mid 20th century. Etienne Balibar's work on it, and the New
mhm,
Left historian Hal Draper's work on it. Um, it's an old Roman concept that sort of refers to emergency rule. Um, the term dictatorship does, and in that sense, after Hannah Arendt and the theories of totalitarianism, after fascism, I think we have a very, very different idea of the very concept of dictatorship. After Stalinism, it's been very tainted. But I think it's important to say its 19th century valence or sort of application. It was not to be understood necessarily in the same way as we in the 21st century understand it. That's a crucial point. And I say that because Marx and Engels began early, really late 1840s, to begin to adopt this concept of dictatorship of proletariat. And the first thing to note is that it has to do with their desire to distinguish themselves from Blanchism and the prehistory of the dictatorship of the proletariat. I've done some genealogical work on this, and Hal Draper does a good job of this in his text, and I'll invite you to build on this as well, Ian. Is that you see it coming out of Babeuf and the Conspiracy of Equals in the French
mhm,
Revolution, where it's kind of like a radical uh, constituent dictatorship that's kind of plebiscite based. And so in that sense, it's kind of a precursor to a type of radical republicanism. Um,
mhm,
and but then with Blanchism, Louis Auguste Blanqui, you get a different conception of it, where Marx and Engels get into this sort of back and forth debate. Members of the Communist League, a party that they were affiliates with at one point, they begin to theorize, even in the mission statement of their organization, the necessity for a dictatorship of the working class, is what they initially call it. And can you say a bit more about that prehistory? Prehistory meaning pre-Second International. Can you say a little bit more about how Marx and Engels kind of face this concept as a political concept and how it sort of molds for them, right? Leading up to 1871 and the Paris Commune, right? Can you give us can kind of fill in some of that, if that's all right?
yeah. Um, the obvious point I think to start out with is the letter that Marx writes to Wedemeyer, or he says, the I bourgeois historians have all identified all the same things that I have, right? This idea of class struggle, this is not new. The thing that I have discovered is none other than the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Um, and like this is and this is a pretty unambiguously uh, Republican idea um, that that priest that really calls for the idea. I mean, I think a really useful way of understanding it, or that the way that Marx and Engels would have understood it, is that the dictatorship of the proletariat, the way it ought to work in a certain sense, is that the working class um, gains veto power over the whole social reproduction of society. Um, Meaning that, and this is a very Republican idea, which is that the parameters that dictate how society works, unfolds, etc. Today is the class that dictates that is the bourgeoisie. So everything. So even if there are plenty of, I mean, they're being torn down currently, but even if there are plenty of um, institutions that are state funded, that you know or alternatively, the existence of work, there are contexts where workers are able to organize and so on. Ultimately down the line, because the bourgeoisie retain just the logic of society functions along bourgeois lines, that eventually it will become subordinated to uh, bourgeois social dynamics, precisely because the buck has to stop somewhere, and that's going to be with the bourgeoisie. With with the dictatorship of the proletariat, you get the other side of that, where the the conditions of life for the working class, the create a class that is capable of collectivizing um, collectivizing the whole social reproduction of society in such a way that universal human freedom could be unleashed through the rulership of this particular class. So that's like the standard Marxist
Right.
explanation. The history around it, and I think Bruno Leipold's recent
Yep.
Citizen Marx is really excellent for drawing up the context around which Marx is developing his ideas, because the dictatorship of the proletariat is sort of what automatically emerges if you make a transition from the Republican ideas around the question of social inequality, because the way that Marx was certainly a Republican, but he makes this huge transition, mainly in relation to um, mainly in response to people like Karl Heinzen, and what is his name, Linton, who's these Republican thinkers in Germany and England, and obviously against Proudhon, where the big difference is that in order to deal with the social question, you have to transition from the idea that everyone should have private property, to the idea that that private property has to be entirely abolished. Um, and this can only occur with society being subordinated to the interests of a class that has no property, that has no interest in having property, in fact. And and I think, as and there is the major question. I mean, like the transitions in Marx's thought as he's responding to something like the Paris Commune, um, which presents a lot of issues. I mean, like it's Marx, certainly the Marxist idea, the dictatorship of the proletariat, it moves from the idea, because Marx is not at all clear in a lot of his writings on this as to what the form of the dictatorship of the proletariat has to be prior to the Paris Commune. It seems to be that he's calling for the necessity of participating in parliaments, for example. This is mainly because he's trying to not only push against the sort of hyper political, politics only side of the Republican side, but also because he's trying to deal with the anti politics of socialist thinkers prior to him. And then the dictatorship of the proletariat is for him a way of sort of bridging that gap, but it's only with the Paris Commune and the idea that the dictatorship of the proletariat has to be articulated through a commune state, or a state which is composed of the various factions of the working class, that the dictatorship of the proletariat becomes fully legible in his thought, I would argue.
Yeah,
It's for that thought.
that's how I read it as well.
Mhm.
Although uh, Marx has a famous phrase from the Civil War in France, to paraphrase, uh, kind of like, what the Paris Commune taught us is that
Mhm.
the working class cannot take immediate ownership of the machinery of the state.
Yeah, yeah.
But that, so help us
Which is
understand
a
that concept there.
self-criticism. I
Well,
mean, which is
it's very
yeah.
interesting because in a certain way, there's a lot at stake here in the sense that dialectic. It's a sort of dialectical point about
Mhm.
the necessity of multiple negations onto the state itself, as I read it, in the sense that if the working class cannot just um, come sort of take over the state as it exists within the bourgeoisie. Um, like if you read, for example, Isabelle Agaro, a French communist thinker today, in her recent book Communism and Strategy, her interpretation, which I think is very interesting, has to do with this idea of like a subtraction from the process of taking political power and the cultivation of an intervalic period. And that intervalic period is what the dictatorship of the proletariat names. In other words, dictatorship of the proletariat names a process of a second negation after a revolutionary seizure of the power, whether that be thought through parliamentary means, through a party, or whether that be thought through an uprising vis-a-vis an example like the Commune, Paris Commune. Okay.
Mhm.
Both could be inclusive. The dictatorship of the proletariat names a process of a second negation, as I would theorize it. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. In other words, it's this intervalic period that becomes necessary. Like in other words, uh, the working class may not also be immediately primed or prepared to
Mhm.
manage the state. How do you understand that? Is what I'm saying makes sense, or would you take a different interpretation?
No, I mean, I think it's interesting. It reminds me of I've been recently reading Rebecca Comey and Frank Ruta's The Dash, and it sounds almost like a sort of it sounds like a sort of Marxist rearticulation of the way they talk about, spirit's traversal from second nature into the despiritualization of spirit itself, from the phenomenology
I mean,
to
it is
the
all
science of magic.
all I'm really trying to say is it's
So
I'm just
it's
trying
like
to say
this
it's the
double.
negation of the negation,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's negation of the negation, of yeah, I mean, it's I mean, if the point is that I mean, if the point is that the idea that Marx through the idea, that the idea that Marx for so there's this idea in sort of post-Marxian, post-Castoriadian thinking that what Marx really wants to do is wants to abolish politics and create a sort of non-contradictory world. You know, it could be very well the case that like what she's pointing at, what Garo is pointing at, is precisely that this idea that Marx wants to that this is fundamentally a misreading, that Marx wants to abolish politics, but really wants to, like, this process of the negation, essentially the self-abolition of the working class, that being which I would think, that what this is a misunderstanding, that what Marx really thinks what has to happen through the dictatorship of the proletariat is that it's the negation of bourgeois rule, the creation of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then the negation of the proletariat itself. Essentially, that the dictatorship of the proletariat is an institution which is the first institution in human history which creates a structure through which it can abolish itself. Right.
Exactly.
It's
Exactly.
the same type of psychoanalytic institution that Lacan was trying to found. Um,
Yeah.
not that I
Thank you.
think that.
Thank you for that. That is like score one more point for the Marxist Lacanians. That
Yeah.
was that's an excellent point.
Well, no, I mean, it's so interesting because I mean there is a lot of like the logical structure of Lacanian psychoanalysis that rings so deeply with Marxism, right? Like you read, I mean, if you go through the nightmare that is reading Letodi, you get negation of the negation in the form of the traversal from meaning sense into the non-sexual, or I'm sorry, the non-rapport of sexuality, right? Sorry, this is a
Right.
completely separate conversation that we should not be
Well,
having. Um,
it's also this idea that, well, like let's tether with this a little bit more, because I mean
yeah.
it's a practical way to understand like what dialectics is for Marxism,
Mhm.
frankly, and why, like, in the history of Marxist polemics, if somebody were to deny the validity of the negation as a political operator, like we
Mhm.
are talking about, then you would get back into this theological hermeneutic of exclusion, right?
Mhm.
So Castriatus is taking, maybe you could criticize as an ultra leftist position, which, I mean, it has interesting stakes though, because, so say for a thinker like Bolivar, what he says the dictatorship of the proletariat allows is for the proletariat to come into contact with a form of social reality building. So there's like a political epistemology, right? Um, that the intervallic period opens, which
Mhm.
then becomes like the precondition for the negation of the class for itself in a certain way. But that is only allowed through the proletariat assuming the power to begin with, right? So the idea that the working class would think their self-abolition through a grand event or through a singular event, I think is the heart of the debate, and I think that a lot of uh this kind of like enmeshes. Like if you take Kojin Karatani,
Mhm.
his famous argument in Trans Critique is that Marx sublated Bakunin after the Commune, and that the debates subsequent to the Commune between anarchists and Marxists are kind of like non-starters. They're kind of like not that relevant anymore. And that kind of explains Karatani's own practice of associationism, which he thinks is about uniting anarchists with Marxists, right? And I wanted to ask you about that, like how you could you say a little bit more about that, perhaps? Like, because perhaps that is the heart of what this is something that Derek Varn and I kind of touched on too. Um, how we read that difference may actually imply a lot in terms of
Mhm.
how we think about class abolition. Because if Marxism is dedicated to class abolition, uh, it actually then matters a lot how you think this procedure of the double negation. Do you see it that way?
Oh, sure. I mean, my problem historically just with anarchists is that I just find it very difficult for them to buy into the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat because most of the time they just get scared of the word. Um, you know, uh, and I don't believe in repackaging things. I believe in like being honest about a concept and clarifying it in order for people to buy into it, and then you mostly just get people rejecting it outright, um, which is deeply frustrating. I mean, a lot of the reason why I find the history of German social democracy so interesting is actually because it looks an awful lot like what anarchists sort of want in a certain sense, right? Like this essentially massive mutual aid network created by workers. Um, and its political commitments are at in the time that I'm really interested in at the end of the 19th century tend to be pretty viscerally anti-state, at least the Marxist variants. Obviously, the Lassalleans and those who are the revisionists and so on are much more pro-state. But like, but then and so like it seems to me that there's a bridge to be built there. Because the problem with modern social democratic thinking is that it's entirely focused towards electoralism. It's entirely focused um, towards in various ways supporting the Democratic Party and not towards class independence. Anarchists unambiguously, I would assume, believe in class independence. Um, but it's questionable whether or not even those who consider themselves, economic Marxists consider themselves, part of this. And I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Karatani. And because I think Karatani, whether he knows it or not, really brings out why the dictatorship of the proletariat is so interesting, but not in trans critique, but probably in his book, The Structure of World History. Because I do think there is a world historical event that the dictatorship of the proletariat is the word for, which, the Wedemeyer essay, or not, I'm sorry, the letter to Wedemeyer really really demonstrates, which is this idea that the whole of human history found ways to bury mode of exchange D, or the idea of in the form of religion, which then the discovery of the dictatorship of the proletariat sort of makes historically unnecessary. We don't need these ideological structures to hide the essence of communism. Now we can through the dictatorship of the proletariat actually realize that in real life. Um, yeah, I find it, but with regards to anarchists, I mean, I just don't really know. I don't really know how to convince them particularly well. I mean, maybe we can sort of talk about the sort of growth of neo-Kautskyism, because that's really, I think, maybe where there's a discussion to be had there, and why I bought into it in the first place. That kind of clarifies, maybe points in the direction of like where there is a conversation to be had with anarchists, but also the people on the Marxist Leninist and Bolshevik Leninist side.
Yeah, let's do that. But first, a quick word on Kojin Karatani. He has a new book out on power that's not translated yet. He's a Japanese philosopher.
Mhm.
I've talked about him with Gabriel Tupanamba on my show. Just folks can check out that. We did an introduction to his work. Um, Now, just as a side point, in his book on power, he deals with Engels, which you may remember in Trans Critique in the introduction.
Mhm.
He actually argued that Engels was a left Ricardian, and that Engels actually put forward a conception of class struggle that led to profound violence, because he thought it was a theoretical error on Engels's part as a left Ricardian to think of the class struggle almost as like a vulgar, like lordship bondage struggle in like
Mhm.
Hegel's phenomenology, right? You may remember that. And I always felt like that's very tragic for you to throw Engels under the bus like that, right? And it was. And
Mhm.
but now I think he may actually have changed his mind on that. Um,
Well, I think the investigations, from William Clare Roberts and Bruno Leipold, into like and sort of pointing towards the Republican logic of Marx and Engels thinking has kind of, I think, really possibly like deflated a lot of the readings of Marx and Engels that have existed before, that are sort of like, this sort of like, oh well, like the origin of Stalinist violence, you can find it all the way back in, Engels and Kautsky. It's like, no, this is
Well,
like,
I think
make
the other
we can't
danger
just talk
there.
about the
Oh
historical
yeah, you're
specificity.
totally right. You're totally right. But I think the other problem that I have with some of these um, ways of interpretation where it's what you might call like theoreticist,
Mhm.
because what the crux of his argument was that through a improper understanding of Marx's capital, Engels derived a poor praxis. And that is giving theory quite a lot of weight, which is not necessarily wrong to do that. Um, but perhaps it is a kind of idealism to do that. I'm not sure. But let's just return quickly to what Karatani might say about dictatorship of proletariat, because I don't think that he actually cares, or not that way. I don't think that he has any fidelity to it as a concept.
No, no, no.
And not at all, because remember, and this may change in his thought, his understanding of historical materialism, how we overcome uh, fetishized commodity social relations, he thinks needs to not privilege the productive sphere of political organization, that it actually needs to privilege the consumptive sphere. And the consumptive sphere, therefore, almost, yeah, well, that's why everything is about boycotts and consumer based power, exerting consumer power. Um, the problem with that is it's a bit one sided, and it's also sort of been tried a lot and has not
Yeah,
produced. So within all of that, I don't see any commitment to something like dictatorship of proletariat. So I wanted to ask you what you
yeah.
meant. What
Well, I
did you
mean that.
mean by that? Yeah.
Well, I think that there are points where Karatani's, like, the logic of how Karatani is thinking exceeds what he is explicitly saying. I think this idea, I mean, because I'm also trying to think through, like, why does religion, for example, become so incredibly reactionary in the 20th century, in the 21st century? And it seems to me, I mean, like, these are just sort of conversations that when you're talking with your theory friends, like, oh, what's your interpretation, right? Like, so here's this book that points in the right direction. But I think that what does religion do for Karatani? It preserves this idea of a it preserved this idea of a um, egalitarian communal mode of life that had existed prior to the rise of um, tributary forms of economic exchange. In other words, um, you know, the rise essentially. Well, actually, no, prior really to gift economies, where you find this like communal way of life subordinated, right? In Karatani's ideas, you have all of these different modes of exchange, right? State forms of exchange, gift modes of exchange, commodity exchange, and non-reciprocal forms of exchange, I guess, like the communist mode of exchange. You find all of them in every society and actually in every instance of exchange, but one is over determining the rest. And he thinks that religion is the mode through which the communist mode of exchange is preserved. Um, and when my response to him in a certain sense is to say, well, actually, like the discovery of the dictatorship of the proletariat, right, means that religion in the way that religion functions as a mechanism for preserving that is no longer necessary. because the dictatorship of the proletariat has been identified, and now we can, move. Now we can have the revolution and create a society through which mode of exchange D is the overdeterminant mode. And I think it's like, I think like Karatani's point that all of these modes of exchange will still be present here and there, just because like, like you just need a centralized structures for distributing resources during crises, for example, or you need to have we might not need gift exchange, but I'm sure people will still be, giving people gifts and so on, but it won't be the primary structure through which social power is accumulated. In commodity exchange, who knows? Maybe we'll meet alien civilization, and there's a barrier between us and them, and we trade at that level. But something like, I'm just making, imagining like how does that get preserved under communism? But communism is overdeterminant over everything else, right?
Yeah, for sure. And he doesn't theorize the road to power. Um,
Oh
and I
no,
think
yeah,
and I think that's a blind spot in his work. But okay, so let's move on to what you just hinted at. I think we've done a nice job of bringing our sort of historical chronology up to the time of the late, like the turn from into the 20th century. Um, could we start before we talk about the contemporary Renaissance in Kautsky studies? Could you just give us an overview of how Karl Kautsky theorizes the dictatorship of the proletariat in his own work? Just to kind of lay it out, a bit of
yeah,
a kind of overview of that.
yeah. I mean, the way I understand it is that you have to understand the dictatorship of the proletariat through concepts that are adjacent to it. So I draw up this triad between the dictatorship of the proletariat, the idea of the minimum maximum program, and the idea of the strategy of intransigence. Um, a lot of this is like very. I mean, anyone who's read Mike McNair will definitely see his influence in my thinking. Probably one of the core thinkers for me. And the reason why I do this is that you have to understand. I mean, the dictatorship of the proletariat. What is it? It's an interstitial form of rule dividing between where the economic structure of capitalism still exists, but the political there's a change in the political composition of society where the bourgeoisie has no longer has power, but instead the working class has power, and increasingly, and this enables um, the working class to have legal sanction to begin um, expropriating the expropriators, right? Like collectivizing. I don't want to say nationalizing, but because that can be problematic. But definitely collectivizing all of the productive apparatuses that are necessary for the social reproduction of the whole of society. So there's no point in, like the obvious thing is always, oh, they think they're going to take away all of, they think we're going to take away all of private property. No, what we're taking away is the things that are necessary for the reproduction of society, and no longer allowing these things to be private, right? Um, and there are bases through which this, and for Marx and Engels and Kautsky, there are very particular ways through which like you have to like through which this can be through which this has to be inaugurated. So one thing, I mean, so the strategy of intransigence. What is this? It's opposition to the state. Um, it's really a balance sheet of the oh god, what was his name, of Louis Blanc's involvement in the French state, who was a socialist. Um, because Louis, because he ended up working as the, I think, the Minister of Labor under the, god, who was he? He worked basically under the same guy who crushed the Paris Commune, right? So there's a socialist who becomes complicit essentially in in a state which itself is hell-bent on preventing the working class from gaining any more power. And so and the reason why you want to be intransigent is so that, essentially you don't have to be forced into the position of opposing the forces that put you in power in the first place. In other words, the working class. You want to have a mechanism. You want to have to remain subordinate to your own rank and file. Otherwise, if you take power over a state that has had no alterations, that has not changed at all, you're going to have to take responsibility over the police, over the military, well, specifically a standing army, um, and a dozen other things really which are opposed to the life ways of the working class. And you can fight from the outside, and there's a preference for fighting from the outside and pushing for reforms over the state, um, by using the power of the working class, by using things like strikes, but also, doesn't whatever tactic is appropriate in order to gain certain reforms. More often than not, those reforms for German social democracy revolve around political freedom. And there's a discussion to be had about, whether or not the current reforms that we struggle for in kind of modern democratic socialism constitute a similar struggle for political freedom, or if there's something else. But but the most important thing with this is that you have a bifurcated program, the minimum and maximum program. It is worth noting that when Marx is writing this, he doesn't actually call it the minimum maximum. The 1880 program of the French Workers' Party doesn't actually call it this. They're usually divided between political and economic sections. I'm not sure who coins the phrase minimum maximum program. My sense is that probably this is probably a Bolshevik thing. It's definitely in Trotsky's the transitional program, but I haven't quite figured out where this transition from political and economic to minimum and maximum comes from. It's definitely a project that I'm sure Lars Lee or Ben Lewis has on the back burner. Um, but the point here is that the minimum program is a balance sheet of all the conditions that have to be met before the working class ought to take should take power, so that they don't have to so that the working class party, or the various parties that the working class articulates its power through, uh, imagine something like the Paris Commune, right? Once they take power, they won't have to basically be subordinated to bourgeois interests. And then the maximum program is, as we talked about earlier, negation of the negation, all of the economic transformations that will abolish the conditions necessary for the reproduction of the forms of that will abolish the forms of oppression that made possible the
Got
creation
it.
of a class without property.
So we have
Um,
so we have three concepts. Let me just reiterate them just to make sure we're on the same page. We have intransigence, which refers to uh, sort of communist directed activity within the context of bourgeois rule, parliamentary rule.
mhm,
Then we have minimum maximum, which presupposes that working class has replaced bourgeoisie as the central power broker of the system.
mhm. Well, I would
Is
say
that
that, like,
correct?
the dictatorship of the proletariat is a sort of fulcrum from the minimum to the maximum.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's interesting then is that Kautsky emerges as a figure who's thinking a consistency of the continuity of this concept of dictatorship of proletariat
Mhm.
within a kind of broader Republican parliamentary context. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the reason why he's, I think, forced to do this is because at the end of the 19th century in Germany, you have a period of relative social peace, especially after I think, the German population is fairly exhausted with war after the Franco-Prussian War, and you also have relative economic prosperity. A lot of this comes from the importation of guano into the what is it the agrarian into German agrarian production at this time. Although it's
Mhm.
very rapidly is going to collapse. But you have hyper nitrogenized soil in Germany all of a sudden, and which is driving sort of relative economic prosperity, and so you have social peace. You don't have the conditions that generate the Paris Commune. And so I think Kautsky is trying to Kautsky and really August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht, all of these thinkers are trying to think about how do we put the working class in power during a period where they don't seem particularly interested in it. And so, in a sense, the program becomes a mechanism to sort of congeal the experience of the Paris Commune in the context of a sort of sleepwalking Germany at this time. Um, and and I would say that the Russian Revolution, in a certain sense, is evidence of why this was a good idea to sort of
1905.
preserve. Well, 1905 and subsequently
Right,
1917, right?
right.
They preserved these ideas, and then the Russians were reading them in the one context where they were actually growing and where the working class was growing in power, or the working class party was growing in power. And then as soon as the conflagration happens, the working class is actually able to take power because even if these people will betray their own, Kautsky, and even though Kautsky will unambiguously betray his own position in 1917, the work of preserving these ideas, does create the conditions through which the Bolsheviks are able to utilize his thinking to take power. And this goes extremely deep. I mean, like you can in my article, I mean, 1905 is an enormously important context. But the agrarian context is also really important because the dictatorship of the proletariat is not only addressed to the necessity of is not only an address to the working class for why they should take power, but also to other classes why the working class should take power, right? Because as as the agrarian populations decline, he's kind of trying to say, it's only through the dictatorship of the proletariat that you can actually that like it should only be in the context of the dictatorship of the proletariat that a lot of the reforms that people like who is it? Lebedauer and these other revisionists are calling for within the agrarian context. Really should be inaugurated because the alternative, if we actually do these things, it'll subordinate them to Bismarck, and we don't particularly want that. We want the peasants on our side, is kind of what he's arguing.
Yeah, that's why Lenin first experimented with renaming the dictatorship of proletariat
Mhm.
to the, dictatorship of the working class and the peasantry as a unity.
Mhm.
But
And and
that then changes
Kautsky has
after.
articles. And Kautsky has articles. I mean, like if you read, I mean, like this is really, I mean, the first text in the rediscovery of Kautsky is this 1993 Marxism and Revolution by Moira Donald,
Yep.
incredibly underrated book where she talks all about how Karl Kautsky developed really the idea of the Schmidt. I can speak German and I can't pronounce Schmidtke. It's a very awkward word to say. But she argues that he developed this idea all as early as 1904 of the unity, where he's arguing for the unity of the working class and the peasants,
Yep.
right? And then, of course, I cite Radek telling Kautsky, you developed this idea. You sided with the bourgeoisie, and we have your articles, we have receipts. Um,
Right. So Lenin, is very fond of Kautsky in these early years, leading up to 1905 and after, and he translates Kautsky into Russian. He translates the social
1894.
question. Is that right? The social question, and what else does he translate? Or the
I mean,
social revolution?
he translated, so that he did that in 1907, I think, but he had translated the class struggle, the Erfurt program, from 1891 into Russian as early as 1894. So
Mm,
he was translating Kautsky from the beginning.
okay,
Um,
got it.
and I don't know if he translated the Diakofrage, the agrarian question, but I know that he read it as soon as it came out in 1899.
Yeah. So Kautsky's position then is that the socialist movement needs to sort of run cultural and political propaganda, so to speak, for convincing the masses in the rightness of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Because one of the things that's interesting when we go back to the Blanquist conception of the dictatorship is that because Blanquism was elitist, right? They actually maintained a kind of secretive basis of it.
Mhm.
And I felt like Kautsky is interesting from a Marxist point of view because he's not working on a kind of esoteric theory of the dictatorship. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, the contrast is between, Blanqui and Babeuf, right?
Right.
Because Babeuf is the one, right, who's openly it's funny that he calls it the conspiracy of equals. The conspiracy of equals itself, you see that idea reflected in the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is this sort of almost deliberately rhetorically contradictory name, right? Because you have, oh, this is a conspiracy. Then why are you just passing out flyers everywhere? Like it's the conspiracy of everyone coming. You're all in on it, right? And so the
Well,
dictatorship of the
yeah.
proletariat
Part of it
is,
also part of it
you know,
also is interesting because in order to have a kind of fidelity to the soundness of the dictatorship of the proletariat, one must acknowledge that we already live under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And so,
mhm,
but that actually means is that Marxist needs to sort of do the proper communication, right, and theoretical elaboration regarding that fact. And this is actually why Bolivar goes this that a point on epistemology that I made,
mhm,
which is that it's not actually the case. Well, the presupposition of maintaining a fidelity to dictatorship of the proletariat, according to Lenin, presupposes that every worker has, by virtue of their exploitation or as an effect of their exploitation, uh, kind of lives with that knowledge, which is otherwise repressed or suppressed,
mhm,
that we live in some type of dictatorship of bourgeoisie. But so therefore, uh, like it's almost like the beginning point of Marxist pedagogy, if that makes sense.
yeah. The task of Marxism is to make legible is to make legible the I is to take those because that's inchoate, right? It's not because there is, of course, on the left, and I would say it leads to right-wing politics, the idea that, a sort of plebeianism that assumes that, the worker always already knows perfectly well, about their own oppression and so on. But and I don't consider it to be elitist to say that, like, the task of Marxism, the merger of socialism and the workers' movement, which is an idea from Kautsky, um, well, not really. It's really largely picking up on Hal Draper and then saying this is Kautsky's idea, but we'll put that aside. But the point is to make legible, um, the possibilities that are unleashed if this person, this worker who has no property of their own, was to suddenly run society, right? And Balabar does talk about how we can't get rid of intellectuals, but they do need to be subordinated to the movement that this class belongs to as it comes into power, and argues that like we can use the sort of intellectual labor of intellectuals, um, because it's like, sure, every cook can govern, but can they develop a recipe in a certain sense?
Yeah, very helpful. So I do want to ask you to elaborate in the future in a moment about this merger theory, because if you listen to comrades, on the neo-Kautskyist left today, a lot of people talk about this concept. But maybe we could take a step back first and give us a sense of the revival of Karl Kautsky on today's socialist left. You had already intimated that Lars Lee is one of the chief theoreticians of this. But perhaps, Ian, you could also speculate about some of the kind of unique historical conditions that we face that make Kautsky once again relevant. Because I feel that there's something um, that needs to be theorized about that, right? Like something perhaps having to do with a post 2008 context of stagnant capitalism, or I don't know how you might get at that, or even if you've thought about that. I'm assuming that you have.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's so reflections on what may I mean, so there's my own personal journey. I think like the sort of the history of conversion is always kind of interesting. The thing that really convinced, because I was kind of like an online left communist for from the time I was like 19 to the time I was like 22 or whatever. And the thing that really convinced me about about neo-Kautskyism, I think, was reading Mike McNair. And my I always had an anxiety about trying to justify, well, trying to think through. I mean, like I had always been opposed and had a lot of anxiety about, without even whether I knew it or not, about Stalinism. I know that you don't like this term particularly, um, and I am using it in the way that Trotskyists use it. Um, but we can have a discussion on like what Stalinism is. You and I disagree. I think it is a thing, and I think it's embodied in the form of party monoliths, anti-democratic organizing, and things like that. But I always had an anxiety about this, about Stalinism, but also I had very little interest in becoming a Trotskyist. Um, and anarchism seemed to sort of end up, I've been around anarchists for many years, and it sort of had this like anti-intellectualism to it that really scared me off. Um, and Mike McNair made these like really good arguments where he points out that Trotskyism and Stalinism both end up not democratic centralist but bureaucratic centralist, meaning that um, the refusal to allow organizations the right to faction, right, which I think is incredibly important, ends up with the eradication of democracy, because to be able to faction is to be democratic. Um, and so there, and so like that belief in the necessity of the internal logic of an organization being, having political freedom, was really, really seductive to me. Um, and with regards to the nature of revolution, he makes this argument that, you know, uh, when it comes to the aftermath of a revolution, it really does matter how the party is structured, because any further political, any further political party or any faction that emerges in a post-revolutionary situation, that organization is going to be modeled after whoever did the revolution, right? We know this because if you're in a if you're in a political party after the American Revolution, you're going to end up modeled after the Democratic Republican kind of party, right? Um, or if you are in France and post-war France, right? You're going to have the structure of the party is going to be de Gaullist. If you're in if you're in England through the whole 20th century, your political party is going to be based on the Tory party, even the Labour Party. Um, so Mike McNair makes these arguments, and I went like, shit, this is really good. This idea that you know, and furthermore that there are forms of political organization that will simply not be allowed to exist. And people will argue, "Oh, this is so authoritarian to not allow any form of political rule to exist." To which I would respond to anyone who, American liberals and I would respond to the generic American liberal by saying, "Well, here's a question: could you be a British loyalist in the aftermath of the American Revolution? No, you get sent to Canada." I mean, the only reason America didn't have a French Revolution scale reign of terror, or have their own version of Red Terror, was because of was because of their geographic isolation. And if you think and really they did, right? Like I mentioned, they sent, 100,000 British loyalists to Canada. Um, so so it's sort of like you have to deal with the fact of the inevitability of the fact that you're going to have to suppress former forms of political organizing. And that's just a part of revolutionary politics. Um, and of course, the other problem is that like revolution is historically inevitable. Things will eventually collapse, and we need to be ready for that. That's sort of like one argument for Marxism as a whole. Um, Yeah, so that was kind of my personal journey. It was also reading. It was also sort of the few conversations I've had with Ben Lewis, and reading his really excellent book on translations of Kautsky's writings, which I cite more than I should in my article. I should really be using the German sources, but I wrote it over 3 months, so I didn't really have the time to sit down and get all of the German sources. Um, uh, and a lot of my arguments about intransigence also come from his writings. Yeah. So with regards to the relevance of, why is it that the neo-Kautskyists why is it that neo-Kautskyism now, in a certain sense, is the sort of question that you're posing more broadly. My own sense. I think a lot of it comes. A lot of it comes from the experience beginning in. In England. You could probably have somebody from England on. Maybe Mike McNair. You could, have on to explain why emerges in England at the time that it does. It's probably, I would argue, due to the collapse of the old CPGB in the 90s. And then in the United States, the fall of the Soviet Union and the complete collapse of financial support going into Marxist-Leninist organizations really led to their relative decline. And then on the flip side, you have Trotskyism, um, which had declined, had itself declined after Jack Barnes kind of wrecked the SWP, and you have the endless splitting. I think, in which itself I think is really like the historical experience of the endless splitting within Trotskyism and Marxism Leninism really really, I think, made a lot of people look around and go, why are we always splitting? Like, what is the point of this endless splitting over different interpretations of the Soviet Union or something like this? This seems pointless. And Mike McNair was one of the early people to come around and make legible the reasons why this was pointless, right? Like the problem is that you all unify around theory. You don't think in terms of program. Um, and and certainly, I mean, in the aftermath of, especially Occupy Wall Street, which could not create consistent, steady organizations. There was a deep need for that, for some sort of steady organization, which obviously the DSA, became the sort of perfect receptacle in 2016, especially after Bernie. And obviously Bernie motivated a lot of the emergence of like neo-Kautskyism. I think a lot of people who are kind of ultra left wanted to find an excuse to moderate their politics without giving up Marxism. I was certainly included in that.
That makes
Um,
sense. Yeah, that's helpful.
yeah, yeah,
That's really
because
good. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
um, yeah, and I mean there was also, just the whole historical experience of this, the anti-democratic character of both Trotskyism and Stalinism, and its sort of mirror image in anarchism, because it's very hard to be democratic when you don't have a structure, right? You just get a series of petty tyrannies. Anyone who's been in anarchist organizations can tell you that. Um, yeah, and then obviously, like, there's been this slow trickle of academic work on Kautsky that began probably in 1993 with Moyer Donald's book, and then 2008 with Lars Lee, and then there's been this recent crescendo. I hope to include my name in that, but it's really Ben Lewis, Eric Blanc, um, and Jean Numa Ducange. The social his really ex he recently published a really excellent book on social democracy and the French Revolution. Actually provides some really good understanding for like why Kautsky changed his own positions based on his reading of the French Revolution. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of, yeah. And you also, and recently Maria Todorova's talked about this kind of stuff in her book on Bulgarian social democracy. So, like, so there is this growth of interest in social democracy. I think that Bernie motivated the sort of like interest in this new social democratic movement. And I think also the rise of Trump and the disintegration of the Democratic Party, or at least the legitimacy of the Democratic Party, has really created the space for like, okay, how do we actually organize something that will work? You know?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think we've seen a confluence of a sort of fatalism of the left meeting defeat of the alter globalization movement, and then Occupy, and then left populism. That kind of like 1, 2, 3 uh, has left us with a sense that sort of what's left after the dust has settled. And I think right now, I've noticed, I mean, I had Richard Seymour on a year ago, and we posed the two primary poles of Marxism today between degrowth and neo-Kautskyism, which was perhaps a very crude dualism, but there is something to that, right? If we use this idea of neo-Kautskyism as a kind of Marxism that would be willing to cooperate with parliamentary as well as like extra parliamentary strategies for gaining power,
Hmm.
as well as a Marxism that is class centralized, class emphasized, class first, maybe. Then you then see a whole variety of different forms that neo-Kautskyism could take, from like the a more like productivist oriented uh, form, which may even entail like some of these more right wing experiments or online movements, right? Which they would probably prefer to call what they're doing neo Stalinism, in some cases unabashedly so. And
Hmm.
actually, that drives me to the question that I wanted to ask you next, which is your theory of neo Stalinism. And we don't need to like name names
Hmm.
or any groups, but maybe it's like as a kind of principle, right? Or maybe you could say, Ian, as like an ideological tendency of Marxism. How does Stalinism still persist for you?
I mean,
Like,
I think it
what defines it?
consists. Yeah, I mean, I think it has to. I mean, for me, it has to do with organizational form. The idea that I mean, it exists in as a sort of opposition to political freedom within organizations. So, an anxiety about organizations having too much democracy. So, if you want to, for example, have, so if, for example, there is, you know, abuse within an organization, within your left organization, you can't organize laterally. You have to go to a superior officer, right? This is how the PSL works, for example. If you can ever get your hands on one of their like internal constitutions, or I think it's like the bylaws, like it says explicitly, like this is how you have to, you have to go up and down. You cannot go laterally, in order to deal with basically anything. And so there's that part. Um, so there's the organizational dynamic of yeah, anti-democratic. It's the party monolith. Um, and the flip side, I mean, and of course, I mean, there is obviously, national roads to socialism is like the more obvious one. Trotskyists tend to only talk about the national road to socialism. They're not wrong. The problem is they don't talk about organizational form because they do it too, right? I mean, I like the SW, like I do really sound like I've listened to way too much McNair because it's like, how are you going to say that you're not a Stalinist organization? Well, yeah, we're pro-factional, but only during the pre-conference period, right? That's what the Trotskyists do. Um, and I think like I mean, you could go as so far to say that Stalinism gets articulated at the level of, the refusal to have a program and instead only, and then have this whole smorgasbord of different ways that lead you back to following the smartest guy, right? So you could, for example, say, well, there's one particular reform that's going on right now, so we're going to completely subordinate ourselves to that particular reform. Well, who's the guy who figured out which reform that was? Or alternatively, you could base your organization entirely on the first four Congresses of the Comintern. Well, who's got the time to read that? I can tell you who. That's the guy who runs the organization. So like, so you have so you have this. I mean, you have this on the one hand, the party monolith, follow the leader behavior, but you also in national roads to socialism. I don't know how you feel about that. I'm actually a little more ambivalent to that. I think national roads to socialism and like we can have a bit more nuance with regards to nationalism of the oppressed. Like I mean I think the left communists who are so ardently anti-nationalist that they end up condemning any movement in Palestine, I find particularly loathsome. It's actually what turned me against left communism originally, because they were all just viscerally anti-Palestine. Well, not anti-Palestine, but you know what I mean. Um, and then I, I think, and I think there's also I'm gonna say something that like is going to rub a lot of my like cosmonaut comrades the wrong way, which is that I actually think that like when Spencer, what is his name from Platypus?
Leonard, yeah, Leonard.
Spencer Leonard. When Spencer Leonard describes Stalinism as essentially describing when he describes it as essentially the activity of claiming that a failure is actually a victory, that this sort of double think of refusing to reconcile with the collapse of Marxism and the form of Stalinism, and just sort of instead just saying, actually, this is fine, and we're not going to deal with this. I think there's a lot of validity to that argument.
Hmm.
You know, um, and it's consistent with my own views that in a sense there's this tendency, to always claim on the left that, our failures are actually victories. Anarchists infamous for doing this. If you have so much as the tiniest little, group commune, that was crushed by the police. No, actually, that was great. And you never deal with the fact that, and it never gets dealt with the fact that, like, okay, but why didn't this scale up?
Yeah.
Right? It's always someone else's fault. It's never our fault, right? We never created an institution adequate. We can't be blamed for not producing an institution adequate to its moment, right?
Hmm. That's very interesting. Yeah. So I hear you saying that there's an organizational critique of authority and hierarchy that has a kind of consistency internal to Marxist, like a logic of Marxist political organization. And then I hear you say a kind of maybe what we could call your last point is like theoretical chauvinism, um, where you get some of these like sort of bizarre conclusions that like, well, no, actually, um, Stalin canceling dictatorship of the proletariat in 1936 was fully justified, and that like Marxism and the workers' movement like transcended to some new plane, and like we have to then sort of yeah, how do we reconcile these historical moments of like what constitutes real revolutionary novelty? So
Mhm,
I think that the platypus position on that, I see your point. I don't agree with a lot of their conclusions about how we reconstitute the workers' movement, but
mhm.
I don't think that we need to like follow them in their entirety. But on this point, they are right about that. I agree with you on that point. And what do you but you said at the same time that a lot of cosmonaut folks would sort of push back on that particular point about Stalinism. What did you mean by that, if you don't mind me asking?
Um, well, I don't know. This is a sort of like, I don't want to get too inside baseball. I will just say that, Donald and I have, like, disagreed on the Frankfurt School for a very long time. I think there is a lot of value to Adorno and to like Horkheimer's thinking, and I think, like, just the influence that they have, the sort of the I would say the cornered market over them that Platypus has sort of established has made it so that people really don't want to have any relationship now, at least among the cosmonaut people, like, has kind of produced both the Frankfurt School and anything that they had to say as a sort of phobic bad object. They can't be right about anything because they are who they are. And I'm kind of like, well, like, they stopped clocks, you know.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is why like the work of Loserdo is so significant, and why I would actually argue this like question does not like stop with Stalinism. It also actually transfers into socialism with Chinese characteristics, Dungism, and all of that.
Mhm.
The two are totally related, in my opinion, and that actually opens up like a whole bigger precipice about some of these things we started our conversation with, right? Like
Hmm.
this division between um, Marxism as a primarily theoretically grounded sort of discourse, right? That from the ground of theory, we generate our polemics and therefore like new ideas about the class struggle. I feel and I sense that like the Loserdo position on this um, actually oddly tries to produce a break from that, just as this criticism of Stalinism does.
Hmm.
So, if that makes sense, because what the criticism of Stalinism as this pervasive, lingering ideological problematic, right, which is
Mhm.
what we're getting at. Well, yeah, sure. that definitely is there. But at the same time, we don't want to fall back into the same errors of like Korsch and Lukács, where like we are this like kind of um, theoretically subtracted academic Marxist
Mhm.
position, you know. So I
Yeah,
think
no.
there's a lot to navigate in that, and I'm happy that we're sort of concluding, our conversation on this debate. I'm not proposing that we're gonna arrive at
Well,
an answer to this.
I think that like maybe to bring it back to German social democracy, I think that's like one thing that really draws me to this historical context is really is really the way it produced organic intellectuals. And the fact that the political freedom and the right to free speech and press, that existed within the organization. Um, it's probably somewhat anachronistic to describe it as such, but we'll just go for it anyway. The fact that there was such a culture of intellectual production within German social democracy, I think, is probably its most one of its most valuable aspects. Because you know because um, that can only occur within the context of an enormous alternative culture. It can only occur within an organization that has relative political freedom, and also I think that like what bothers me about the dismissal of the Second International, whether it's in its critical theory forms or the sort of Stalin form, um, and I think well embraced, but to a large degree misunderstood by a lot of the sort of great intellectual historians of the 20th century. Um, I think is how necessary this is. Um, I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but like,
No, I think
but
you're right. I mean, well, it really dovetails nicely with a concept that we didn't define, which is this merger thesis idea, right?
yeah, well, because
Because
the
if
literature
if what you're
socialist,
saying is
yeah,
that the ground of a theory of organization that would be different than neo-Stalinism, that
mhm.
these ideas influence, would be the would be about the creation of strong institutions that would then be capable of achieving something in the future, like the merger thesis, which
And
would
without
have to do
also
right, which would have to do with okay, how can socialist organizations actually solve this antinomy between the division between intellectuals and workers?
yeah, and because the thing is, like, this cannot occur in an organization where everyone has to be unified on the basis of theory, because that means everyone has to agree, right? Whereas if you create, a party that is able to tolerate difference, or, you know, Todd McGowan might like this, contradiction, then you create an environment that's able to produce new intellectuals who are able to you know develop theory that forms the basis for um, a program which clearly understands how the working class can take power, while also creating socialism within the part with like a socialist culture within the party itself that can then sort of proliferate out into society as the dictatorship of the proletariat emerges, because like we do still value um all of the things like the intellectual development. We value art, we value all of the things that come out of this freer form of life that the party itself has to create in a sort of micro form. Right. So I am, in a certain sense, I'm sort of like with the anarchists. Like I actually do believe that we have to have some degree of prefiguration. Not it can't be totally prefigured. We can't build utopias, but we can build organizations that have a particular type of culture, that have a particular pattern of the way we behave and interact in relation to each other, that can point in the direction of a socialist future.
So now that you said that inspiring point there, I must conclude because you can't beat that, Ian. That was very good. But what would you say to people that ask the question, okay, sign me up. That sounds really good. Like what do you know what I mean? Like I mean you don't have to like name organizations, but like,
I
what
mean,
would you
I
point
I'm
people to? Because I mean what you just articulated like legitimately actually sounds very compelling.
mhm. I mean, the problem is that I talk about like the necessity of tolerating contradiction. My early work was on the African Blood Brotherhood, right? Which ended up which ended up dissolving into it ended up dissolving into the Communist Party of the U.S. I think it was originally Communist Party America, you know, and I think there is. I'm not going to say the DSA outright, but I would say that in a certain sense, what I'm pointing to is not only an ought, but also a mode of diagnosis. If something is, there is a possibility for something to be adequate to what I have just said, and the way that you can figure out whether or not this is adequate is, are organizations pooling themselves together? Are they becoming increasingly willing to argue for their own position within an organization that increasingly these different groups are invested in? Right now, that's the DSA. I think that's unambiguous. But I also think that a lot of the factions within the DSA. I mean, the problem with the DSA, you know, the problem with the DSA is like is that there's a really good line from some of Alexander Bogdanov's political writings where he says, the the slowest horse dictates the speed of the whole horde, right? In a certain sense, the revisionism present within the DSA sort of dictates its politics. And I would think, but I would wonder, as these different organizations, whether they're neo-Kautskyists, whether they're Trotskyist slash post-Trotskyist, or explicitly communist, libertarian socialist, etc., as these grow, and slowly take over the organization, I would wonder if they possibly break off from the revisionists and form their own organization, much the same way that the KPD did, right? And there were very real possibilities that they were going to pull the left of the USPD into them. So I think it's sort of like, if you see certain characteristics of an organization that I'm pointing to, like, that tells you that that organization has legs, that you should, that's where the action is. I don't think the action is with neo-Stalinist organizations. I don't think it's with the rotten Trotskyist organizations. And anarchism, it's more complicated. Uh, but I think I think it's probably at the moment with the DSA, and we'll see what happens as history unfolds.
Ian, I want to thank you for coming on my show. Do you have anything that you're working on right now that you might want to share with comrades, either in the world of research or political activity?
I mean, right now, my entire life is just committed to studying German as much as possible. But I've been considering writing something on Bailey Bar and Draper, but right now I'm so busy.
Cool.
I am slowly translating. Actually, no, I am slowly translating some of the articles that I was working with in this article from Kautsky that have never been translated into English. The three-part articles there are three articles, really four, but it has a different name. that ultimately become the basis for Kautsky's seminal The Agrarian Question.
Mm.
And I found all these articles in the Friedrich Stiftung archive entitled what is it? Unser neuestes Programm, right? Our new program. And I'm translating those, and I may be publishing them through Cosmonaut once I'm finished. But it's a slow process.
Yeah. Well,
Other than
thank
that,
you
I'm
so
just off the
much.
hoss.
Yeah, great conversation. I hope that and I know that folks will get a lot out of this. Thanks so much for your work, and hope to have you back on again.
Yeah. See you later.
Thanks.